So just so that I kind of have an idea who's in the audience, how many of you have already used the client object model? This is something that you're familiar with. Well, holy cow, what are you in this session for? Okay, that's okay. I'm going to show you some stuff you don't know. How about that? That'll be cool. All right. That's probably not true, but the idea that the client object model is as large as it is today is amazing. I'm going to be covering how do you get going on it, right? How do you get connected? How do you make sure you've got context? How do you get access to the various pieces that you need? If I'm in an app web, how do I get to the host web and those kinds of things? Okay, so this is, if you're deep down in the trenches, this isn't going to be a deep dive. This is going to be a how do I get there kind of a talk. But I'm going to try to cover all of the various bases, all right? Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Client object model for SharePoint 2013. If you were in my talk yesterday, you know that I advocate using REST when you can, right? The representational state transfer, or Microsoft's implementation of their OData standard, right? So this talk says if you can't do it with REST, then there's this option, okay? So the client side object model. By the way, there's a link there. Let me go ahead and transition back. The link that is listed there will be populated with a slide deck and all of the code when they get it uploaded. Okay, so just jot that down. Probably sometime later today, you can go out and pick up the Evo Dev 20 or Dev 210, and just pull down the information that I'm going to be showing you. All right. Okay, so what's the agenda? I'm going to talk about CSOM and JSOM, but not REST. Right. The differentiation there is that CSOM is the client object model from a managed perspective, right, and JSOM is the client-side object model from a scripted perspective. Really, there's three different contexts in which we can write code in SharePoint. One is declarative. We're not talking about that today, right? That was, I don't know, somebody else's talk. The second one is managed or imperative, and the third one is scripted. We're going to start with scripted because that's got so many nuances to it that we've got to really figure out, all right? So let's see. First thing that you're going to notice when you first generate a... It didn't go. There we go. When you first generate a SharePoint project, it's going to automatically include the Jquery libraries. I don't know about you, but I don't know that I really want Jquery in every single app web that I ever create. And so one of the first things that I like to do is replace the Jquery library with something that is a CDN. However, you don't always know that your code is going to be running where there is a CDN, right? So I use this little stub of code here, which basically says, go try to get the CDN, and if it's there, great. If it's not, then go ahead and write out this local version of Jquery. That way I'm hitting the CDN if I can, but I pick up the local Jquery if I must. Okay, I think that this is working fairly well. I still don't really like the fact that I have to deploy Jquery with every app web that I create, but at least I've got some way of making it more efficient for my client. Second thing that I like to do is replace the icon, because the icon starts out as just a blue square, and that blue square is hard for you to distinguish from all the other blue squares. So I like to go ahead and change it up. Be aware that any transparency that you put into your icon will bleed right through when a person changes the composed look, which is pretty cool. So I've made my icon so that the edge is transparent, the first 2 pixels around the whole edge. So when I change the composed look, my icon changes, and it'll flip back and forth like that. And it's really nice. It makes it feel like your app is responding to their desire to have a certain look, right? It'll adopt one of the colors, so that's pretty cool. I don't have many slides, by the way. First thing that you have to do is get context, right? So we're going to go and we're going to create a project, and this is what they're going to default us to. Believe me, getting context is not always this easy, right? But the idea is if I'm running in a SharePoint hosted app, I'm always in SharePoint, correct? So let's go see this guy work first. I'm going to go ahead and jump into my virtual machine, and I'm going to create a nice little SharePoint hosted app. So I'm going to open up Visual Studio 2012. I'm running Visual Studio 2012 Update 2, which means there's a couple of little things that are not working so fabulous. That said, I think I know all of the ways to jerk it so it goes the right direction when I finally get it to go. Okay, so I'm going to create a new project. I'm going to call this project my Evo SharePoint hosted app. Right? Evo SharePoint hosted, so we know what this is. I'm going to go ahead and put it to my evo.spdevs.net site as a SharePoint hosted app. If you saw Chris O'Brien's talk this morning, was it Chris O'Brien? Was that the guy that did it? Right? He did a fabulous job, I'm sure, talking you through all the pieces of a SharePoint hosted app. So I'm not going to delve into all of the pieces here, but just before I go and deploy this out and you can see those 2 lines of code in action, right? Let's go take a look at what I've actually created over here. So I've got an on-premise dev site, right? It's got an apps in testing, as you can see. And so I created this as a host name site collection, top-level site, as a developer site that I can deploy side-loading my apps in using Visual Studio, okay? Secondly, I also created 2 simple little contact lists, one called Presidents, that includes the list of all the US presidents and some of their information. And I created another one called Prime Ministers, since we are in the UK, right? And I have another leader view of that. Notice the big on-premise in the background there. That's so that whenever we're in this site, you know, we're not in the cloud, right? We're running on my box right here. And that can make a huge difference because who can tell me from Paul Schaefline's talk this morning, right? What kind of authentication is this? Is this ACS or S2S? This is S2S, and that's going to make a big difference when you try to get context, right? Because you're going to have a token eventually. In this case, I'm in a SharePoint hosted app, so I'm talking SharePoint to SharePoint. SharePoint is going to be able to authenticate me using whatever my normal means of authentication is, right? And then use my app permissions to talk to the host web. So we'll get to that in a minute, but I just wanted you to see what I'd set up here. I did that using these 2 list templates that you'll be able to download directly from the link that I showed you at the beginning, right? It's just 2 little SDP files. You upload those into your list template gallery, and then add an app and choose the leaders for US and for UK, and then name it Presidents and Prime Ministers, okay? And then you'll have the same lists and the same test data that I've got running here. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and go into my project. And as I said, when you first start out, the JavaScript library that they have listed here is the direct result of a jQuery call, right? And the jQuery call, or the jQuery that's embedded here is maybe not the best way to go. So I'm going to go ahead and grab out of my the same code that I'm going to have you download, this Evo Dev 210, the CDN, and so that's that no protocol CDN reference, and then the document.write. So that I pick up the right thing. Turns out that when I installed update 2, not a good time to install an update, by the way, just before you do a talk. Just be aware of that if you ever have to give a talk. That I'm going to go ahead and replace this one line here that just directly references the jQuery libraries with these 2 lines of code, which says, go ahead and go out and pick up jQuery 1.7.1. Well, guess what? In update 2 of Visual Studio, they changed. Instead of using 1.7.1, they now use 1.8.2, I think it is. I have to go look, but Visual Studio's out to lunch. Visual Studio, before update 2, does this, and after update 2, it does as well. So there you go. I didn't hear the comment, but working on it, perfect. Visual Studio needs to adopt the voice, right? Then it would be great. I'm going to go ahead and drop this down and look, and it is 1.8.2. So all I have to do in order to fix that up is just make a change to the reference here, 1.8.2 and 1.8.2 down here. But you can see in practice how important it is that if I can use a CDN, why not go that direction, right? But everybody doesn't necessarily have access to one because they might be behind some kind of appliance that prevents them from getting out there. The other thing that I like to do whenever I create a project is I like to go ahead and add into the images section here an image that's going to be my app icon, right? My app icon has got that little transparent image. So I'm going to try to add one of those, and it's jitting itself. So whenever I click on it, it's turning white. That's wonderful. Still working on it. So what we've got is a SharePoint hosted app that's going to let me connect out to my app web. Now, how many people think that most of your resources are going to be on your app web? If they're for your app, that's fine, but if they're for your user, that isn't going to work. Where's your user keeping their information? On the host web, right? So we're going to see if we can address that. I'm going to go ahead and add an existing item out here from my desktop, and I'm going to grab that logo that I talked about. It's a little MindSharp image, and so what will happen is that the edges of that icon actually have a transparent pixel around the outside and will transform as I do a composed look. So I'm going to go ahead and just hit F5 and make this thing run straight away. I'm going to go to the evo.spdevs.net site, and I'm going to try to launch my app. Now, I didn't change anything, right? I just took all the out-of-the-box stuff. How do you think the out-of-the-box stuff compares to what you should be writing? Not too good. Not too good, and we'll prove that. Have you heard of this tool called Jslint? Jslint? I'm going to just demo it for you really quick because I think it's very instructive. What this is sort of a compiler or a syntax checker or rule enforcement kind of a vehicle. You paste your JavaScript in here, click the button, and they'll tell you what you probably shouldn't be doing, right? So that you kind of get an idea of how good your JavaScript is. Let's go take the out-of-the-box JavaScript that they auto-created for me here. Let's see if I can. Well, it's trying to go, so I'm going to go ahead and flip back over to my on-premise environment, and you can say that it's automatically picked up the current user, right? It's automatically said, hello, whoever I'm logged in as, and I'm logged in as the administrator, so it says, hello, administrator. This is on my on-premise site, and it's for the evo.spdevs.net. However, I forgot to launch my Zoom it so that you guys can see a little bit better. Let me just go ahead and launch that real quick. However, even though I told it to go against evo.spdevs.net, you can clearly see that the app is running under app- some kind of a unique identifier for my app, right? And then in the spdevapps.net domain. This is done for app isolation. It makes it so that my app can't go directly to the domain where they're running my app and start doing stuff. Right, I'd have to go across domain from my app domain into the host domain. Since those two things are different, it prevents me from cheating and just going, well, I'm in the same domain, so let me go ahead and just jump up this way. All right? So that's why that looks like that. Now, this just auto ran, right? I didn't have to do anything. We'll check out that code. I'm going to close this browser, and it'll take me back to Visual Studio. From here, what I want to do is I'm going to show you what the JavaScript looks like when they automatically created this. So if I open up my app.js, which is the JavaScript being referenced directly from the page that they defaulted called default.aspx. Let me just double click on that and I'll show you real quick. That's where we put our CDN for jQuery, right? And then just below there, they've got a reference to the JavaScript file called app.js. I'm not super happy with the naming convention there, and I'll change that up momentarily. But that's the default of what we got. So all of our actual SharePoint client object model code is running in here. Let's go grab that code and see just how good a job they did according to Jslint. So I'm going to copy this JavaScript, and I'm going to go over to Jslint and just paste it in there and say, I'd like for you to evaluate this JavaScript for me. And so I just click the button Jslint, and it says that all of this stuff is bad. All of these are bad errors. What do we have, like 50 lines of code and 20 errors, something like that? It's a pretty bad situation. So let me just show you what's going on. First of all, they've got some global variables up here. Those are not good, right? They are waiting for the idea that the page is ready for me to run stuff, right? The DOM is loaded locally so that I can get context and then get a web. I don't know that there's a big deal there, right? Notice that I am getting context using those 2 lines of code that we saw on the slide, right? Very simple. Get the current context. Current context is the app web. Right? And then go get the username, which is a function below. If you know anything about JavaScript, right, sometimes we need our function to be defined before we call it. So they kind of got it upside down here. You should be putting your functions above. So you're starting from the bottom and calling up so that everything's defined first, and then you've got your logic, right? But they call down into this get username. They go ahead and get the current user from the web, right, because that's what I want to display. I load that user and call execute query async. Now, this is called the client object model. The client object model necessitates that we do stuff on the client, stack up all of our requests, send them across as XML to the server, client.svc, where that stack of requests gets processed, And then what gets sent back is JSON. I think I have a slide about this, but I may not have included it in this deck. There's two different kind of objects. There's client objects and there's value objects, right? A client object was established on the client and has no properties, right? It can stack up requests, but it truly has no knowledge about whether it even really exists. How many people have seen the movie Ratatouille? Remember the movie? Okay, enough of you, like 80% of you. You know the little chef, Gusteau, that the rat talks to? At one point in the movie, he discovers that his apparition, this imaginary chef that he talks to, has a son. So he turns to the apparition and says, "Why didn't you tell me you had a son?" Right? And the chef, Gusteau, says, "I don't know anything you don't know," right? I'm a figment of your imagination, because he's a client object for the rat. Right? He doesn't become a value object, but the actual localization of that variable becomes a value object. So user is just a client object, and I tell the server, send me back the details once you've established who user is. So when this is finished, user actually has values, properties that I can go and look at. It's been hydrated. It's no longer an apparition. It's now a value object. Okay? Does that make sense, everybody? So that's a critical concept. Secondarily, notice that I didn't call execute query async on every single thing that I did. I stacked a whole bunch of them up. How come? Because if you do a callback to the server after every single thing, you're going to be super chatty, right? And if you're too chatty, then you're going to have a slow, non-responsive application. However, if you go the opposite direction too far, then you're going to have a stale application, and you're going to go to try to update the server, and somebody else has already changed the stuff. Right? So there's a balancing act with a client object model where you got to go, well, it's about time I go ahead and talk to the server. In this case, I don't have a choice, because if I want to know the actual user's title, I've got to go ask the server, because that client object doesn't know, right? It doesn't know what the server's value is. So in order for me to ascertain that, I have to call execute query async. Wouldn't it be nice if I could sometimes do execute query? So here's where the two models separate. The JSOM model on the JavaScript side of the world, in the scripted context, only allows you to do async queries, whereas the managed context, the CSOM model, only lets you do blocking synchronous queries. You can't do asynchronous in a managed context, and you can't do synchronous in a scripted context. Go figure. Way back in the betas of 2010, you could do both, and then somehow they disappeared. They only left us with one option or the other, depending upon which environment you're in. So I'm doing an asynchronous query because I'm in a scripted context. I don't have a choice. Right? When that finishes, it's going to go to the on success and come down here, and then write out the message. If it fails, it's going to come down here and send out an alert. Now, is an alert a good thing for us to be doing in our production code? No. So Jslint is throwing a, hey, what the heck are you thinking about? We don't want to do any alerts here, and so forth. If I come down a little, that's it. So this simple little JavaScript throws about 20 errors. So let's see if we can do a little bit better. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add existing items into this project. So I'm going to add a page from a previous project that I did. Just go out to my documents, Visual Studio 2012 projects, and there I'm going to find the SharePoint hosted app. It has pages just like this one called Better JavaScript. I'm going to go ahead and add that page in. I'm going to add a script by the same name, and then I'm going to explore them both so that you can see what's going on there. So I'm in the pages still, back up one, go into the scripts, and Better JavaScript. All right, so let's take a look at what we did here. First thing I want to do is I want to grab the Better JavaScript, copy it, and I'm going to paste it into Jslint just like I did before. I like to just refresh the page and then paste it in blank so that I know that I'm getting a fresh set of errors. And down here I only get, actually I'm still getting an alert error, right? It is possible for us to say down here that we've got some options. So I want to go ahead and allow alerts or whatever it is. Let's see, debugger statements, that's not what I want. Anybody see it? Third one in the left column. No? Yes, it is. Yes, that's it. That's the one I want. Thank you. So if I just rerun it again, then that'll go away. I've actually eliminated the alert later anyway, so that we don't use that. We use a status bar instead, right? And we could also use a notification either way. Notifications are really nice because they animate in and they really provide a very good way to handle something that the user needs to know about, but without popping them up with some kind of a gray, status button modal dialog that they have to click on. All right, so let's see. This only has a use strict, should be in the form of a function. I really don't like putting my strict in a form of a function, so I'm going to ignore that error throughout the whole time. Let me go ahead and show you what the JavaScript looks like now. Now you can kind of remember what the other one was, right? We came in, we made sure the document was ready, and then we called into a method that said get the username. It said, well, I'm going to try to get it on the client object model, and then I'm going to fire off an on success or an on failure. That's what we had. So let's look at what we've got now. First, at the very top, I've got a couple of comments that talk to Jslint and say, look, it's okay that I have 3 globals. I have a $ because I'm going to use jQuery. I have MineChart because that's my namespace. And I have SP because I'm going to be using SharePoint. All 3 of those are global variables that are okay. Just above that, I say I'm in a browser. So it's okay that I'm going to use window and document and other kinds of sort of global variables that are obviously part of the browser. Okay, so that's what those 2 mean. And then use strict is something you should be doing at the top of every one of your JavaScript files because it says, don't make me look like an idiot, right? Send me little reminders when I'm trying to do something stupid. And Jslint will really help you to figure out where you're doing something stupid and where you're not. All right, the next line down basically says, establish a global namespace for me. Now, you guys have all used namespaces in your managed code, right? But wouldn't it be great if you could know that your function names are not going to conflict with somebody else's function names? And so having a namespace is as simple as saying, give me a local object called MineChart, right? And if there's already one out there, use it, right? Otherwise, create a new one. So that's all I'm doing here. I'm saying, give me a MineChart object. It's just an empty container. After all, what is a namespace other than sort of a folder inside of your DLL, right? It's just a way of encapsulating your code. So I'm going to create a MineChart namespace. Just below that, I've got the same document ready, but now I'm going to call into a class name dot method, right? It's like a static method. So just below here, I've got a new class called MineChart.demo. It's not really a class, okay? It's just an object. There is nothing else in JavaScript but objects. But this is a nice simulation of what we would think of as a static class. I don't have to make an instance of it, right? But I'm going to say I have this definition of private properties, private methods, public properties, and public methods. And that's a really nice way for us to transition from our managed context over into a JavaScript context in a more confident kind of a way. So just below that, I've got my private members. It says I've got a module level variable called user, another one called context, and another one called web. If you've been doing JavaScript, please note that I am not using a semicolon. I'm using a comma. Separating each of these by a comma makes each one of them an individual component of this overall class. And it's not a class, but I'm going to call it that from now on, okay? So MineChart.demo feels like a class that I don't have to instantiate. I can just directly call into its static public properties and methods. These are private module level variables. Then if I come down here, I've got a private method. I've got another private method, and then a third private method. They call up. So the last one is the one I'm actually going to make calls into, and it's going to refer to the ones above. So rather than going down, we're going to go up because we're in a scripted context. We need to predefine everything before we make calls into it, all right? So at the very bottom, I've got my public members. I've got a public member that's called get_username. That's what I'm actually going to call MineChart.demo.get_username. That will go ahead and in turn call getUsername, which is a private method. That method is defined as a function, or that object is defined as a function, which we know of as methods, right? If we're in an object-oriented kind of a context. So inside of there, I'm going to set my module level variable to the current user. I'm going to load the current user and call execute query. Does that look familiar? Yeah? Then that's going to go ahead and say, if you succeed on doing that, then go up and find the get username, go further up and get the username success, right? The get username success is also defined as a private method that's going to go ahead and write out that username's title. I'm trying to use exactly the same code they did. I'm just pasting it into a better JavaScript context. If I have a failure, it goes ahead and calls into this, and there's still the alert there. So I've used all the same code they did, but let's see how this does in Jslint, or did I already do that? It passes, right? The only thing that it yells about is use strict and that alert down at the bottom. So it's a much better pattern. Suddenly we have a namespace, a class, private members and public members that I can understand and really start to read the code and go, oh, wow, that's so much easier than what I've been doing, right? Using the JavaScript technique that we've all sort of fell into, where we just create everything in the global namespace, and hey, if we collide, then it's the other guy's fault, right? Because I tried to pick something unique. Nobody else would call it Todd. Any other Todds in the room? Just because I'm curious. No? Okay, well, that's cool. I'm thinking about changing my spelling of my name to just T-O-D instead of T-O-D-D, because nobody over 30 years old spells it with 3 letters, right? So, hey, that could make me younger is the idea. All right, let's see how well this works. I'm going to go visit the app manifest. Now, you probably have seen the app manifest. I'm just going to briefly review it. So over here in my app manifest, I can pick the actual icon I'm going to use. I'm going to go ahead and just type that mind sharp 96 by 96. You can pick it, but it's nasty to pick it because then you got to switch the slashes around and all that kind of stuff, or at least you used to have to. My start page is currently the default page. I'm going to drop that down and say we're going to pick the better JavaScript page. So we're going to do that instead, right? On the better JavaScript page, I don't know if I pointed this out, but, whoops, wrong one. But it basically has that same kind of a concept that we were using before. It says go ahead and use the Ajax-based CDN if you can, right? If you can't, then load up the local version. They all say 1.7.1 because I copied them from someplace else. And so it will actually fail on the local one, but we have a CDN here, right? So we should be fine. If we're not fine, then I'll come back and fix it. How about that? You can see down here at the bottom, I've used a slightly different naming convention. So just below app.css, I've got the better javascript.js. I like this naming convention much better. It lets me associate my page with my JavaScript when I'm trying to do client object model stuff. You should use whatever naming convention is right for you, right? But anything that you're going to use from multiple pages, isolate that into its own JavaScript file. And I'm going to talk about utilities momentarily here, okay? How you handle utility functions. All right, so this is the better JavaScript. It's just going to call in. Basically, this is what got generated for me, and I've just got a little H1 at the top that says this is better JavaScript. Let's go ahead and run that and see what happens. We should get launched into the evo.spdevs.net site and see basically the same thing, my username being presented out, but this time we're getting it in a much better, efficient JavaScript style, something that we could replicate because we understand namespaces, classes, public and private members, right? Does that make sense to everybody? So was that worth having there? Yeah, if you download this code, you can go check it out, right? I've been spending a lot of time just trying to figure out what my style is going to be, and this is what's evolving. If you've got suggestions for style, please privately come and talk to me, right? Because I would like to make my JavaScript better. My JavaScript sucked in the past, and I want to make it nice. So that's what I'm trying to do. All right, so again, on premise, what if I want to run this same code in the cloud? Right? What if I want to do that? I'm going to go close out of this. I'm going to go back to my project and just say, I don't want to go against the evo.spdevs.net site. I want to go ahead and go against the HTTP. I'm just going to say that for just a second. / Todd Bleeker evo.sharepoint.com. What does that sound like? That's an Office 365 site, right? You don't have to have any stinking SharePoint locally on your box. You can develop everything against Office 365. Well, let's test that theory out. I went ahead and changed it to HTTP, and I'm actually kind of worried about hitting F5. But what would happen if I did? It's going to fail, right? Because all Office 365 sites are running under HTTPS. And the error message that you get back is really lousy. And it locks your box down for like 5 minutes where you're trying to say, okay, I didn't mean that. Stop trying to uninstall it from the stupid place and actually deploy it to the HTTPS location. So I'm not going to do that during this demo, but try it sometime when you got 5 minutes to waste, right? Because you're going to be like, what the heck is that? And it doesn't say, hey, you typed the wrong URL, right? It says something like your token is missing. And you're like, what are you talking about? So I'm going to go ahead and hit F5 and let it go ahead and burn out there again. This time it's going to launch into a different context, right? Now I've been out there before. I've told it to remember my credentials, so I don't have to go through the process of relogging in. At least that's the hope. It should launch a browser and take me straight in there. By the way, F5 is just a convenient way to do things until you're in Visual Studio 2012 Update 2 and it doesn't work. Right? Then try deploy and just go in the browser yourself and work with it, right? Because you don't need to debug all the time. And it might be even a little bit faster. Hey, it says hello, Todd Bleeker. Check that out. Using my better JavaScript and my Office 365 site, the same code works in both places. This only is true of SharePoint hosted apps. Okay? When we get into the self-hosted apps, either auto-hosted or provider-hosted, we're going to have some issues because, let's just review from this morning, auto-hosted apps use ACS and provider-hosted apps use S2S. They're both an OAuth derivative, right? But they use different tokens and different approaches. The provider-hosted app can use ACS as its authentication, right? But then why are you doing provider-hosted? I guess because your website is someplace else. You're just going to deploy into a SharePoint context. If you're not on Office 365, you need to do some extra work, and I'll show you what that is at the very end of the session, okay? All right, so it worked. That's great. So let's go ahead and get into the actual host web, right? We want to go ahead and grab the title of the host web, not the current user. I currently have an app web context. Let me just flip back to my slides just for one go here. Oh, did it start up in the right place? No, it didn't, of course. Let me jump ahead here. Bump, bump, bump. And there we go. If you want the host web instead of the app web, it's a few more than 2 lines of code. Why is that? Remember, the app web is running under something like app-id dot some other domain. And it's trying to query back into the original place where the app was installed. That's called cross-site scripting. Are we allowed to do XSS, right? Cross-site scripting in a JavaScript context? We are not. So we need some help here. Now, does anybody remember how we did this 10 years ago before there was Ajax and before, when we were just barely out of HTML? Anybody? ASP pages? We used the HTTP request, right, in the underlying browser. And what? Starts with an I. An iframe. We would put a hidden iframe out there, and we would tell it, an app web. We would tell the hidden iframe to go and get our stuff and tell me when you're done, and then we would go look inside the iframe for the DOM and suck out whatever we wanted. So this page was going after something, and the hidden iframe was going after something else. They now detect that, right? So that doesn't quite work as slick as it did. Now what they're going to do is they're going to give us a little help here. We're going to go get the request executor JS, and it will basically do that same concept, right? But it does it all for us. We just say, go run my code. And it does all of the request executor stuff for me. So check this out. First, I need my app web URL. I can get it in one of 2 ways. I can either get it off of the query string, or I can get it out of this local variable. The local variable sounds really cool until it isn't there. Then you're like, oh, well, shucks, what do I do, right? The query string sounds real good until you do a page post back with no query string variable, right? So the very first time anybody comes into your app, you should save aside your query string variables that you're going to need later on in a cookie or in some kind, like in view state, or in some mechanism depending upon the duration that you need to have it, right? If it's just for this particular page, then view state's a great place to go, right? If it's for the overall session, then put it in a session state variable, right? If it's for beyond a session, then put it in a cookie. And I don't have examples of each one of those in this session, but come to my class and I'll teach you how to do all of those, okay? So keeping around the information that you were passed when you first established the application is it's a necessary evil. And so I'm not going to demo this in this session, but you got to keep that around, or the next time you come through, it won't be there. You're going to, hey, give me that query string URL, and you didn't pass it to yourself, right? So now you're in trouble. All right, so just don't forget that. Then I'm going to go ahead and get the current context. That's my app web context. I'm going to use what they call the proxy web request executor factory with that app web URL to generate, what is it again? An iframe, effectively. Behind the scenes, that's really just an iframe. And then I'm going to pass that iframe into the web request executor factory for the context that I'm currently in, and that will generate the necessary elements that I need in order to call the SP app context site. That's called your host web, right? And so from the app context site, I can get the host web with the get web. How do I get context for the host web? These are the lines of code that you use in a JSOM context, right? So let's go try that out. So I'm going to go back to my VM. If I can get back over there. Choop. That's still the slides. Holy cow, there's like 3 slide deals now. I'm in the new Office 2013 PowerPoint, and it's got a totally different console here, so I'm getting used to that. All right, let me try to, is that making that full screen for you guys at all? All right, I want to stop presenting. Maybe I do that. Oh, that's it. Okay, so now I can flip back, and you can see that, right? Excellent. All right, I'm going to go ahead and add another page into this project, and the page that I'm going to add this time is just JSOM, the JSOM page, and it's going to give us the ability to go in and grab that. I'm going to add the JSON Javascript first because I think that I'm already in that context. Maybe I should move it down to where it belongs. That would be good. And then I'm going to add the page called JSON. Now, usually I walk you through step by step the code I'm actually going to paste in here, but it would take us too long today, so I'm just going to do it this way. There's my JSON.ASPX. All right, so let's check a gander at what happened to the ASPX page. You can see that I'm still using that same jQuery CDN, and if I can scroll down a little ways, I'm calling into the JSOM.js file, which is going to contain all my client object model code. Come on. Visual Studio's all whited out because, I told it to go down on a page that's at least 30 lines long. Oh my goodness. I just put JSOM as an H1, and you can see that it's referring to the JSOM.js file. All right? So let's go take a look at the JSOM.js file. Just jumping down here where it is. Again, I've got that use strict. I've got my namespace right on the document ready. I'm going to call into the Minesharp demo get underscore username public member, my public method effectively. Here's my class definition. There's my local variables, just like I had before. Then if I scroll down a little ways, I'm going to see that get name translates into the get username. Get username is going to go get the current user, load them up, and then call into the onSuccess. OnSuccess is going to write out that user's title. Okay, so far so good. Now why did I guess I introduce here the utility. The idea that I can call into another context. So I went ahead and I added a utility script. I'm going to go ahead and add that in now. The utility script that I'm adding in has a bunch of stuff in it. I'm hoping to make this a nicer and nicer and nicer JavaScript file so that we can just benefit from overall use of it. In there, I've once again got use strict. However, I'm extending jQuery with a couple of additional functions here. Get URL vars, because we're frequently going to be getting the variables off of our URL. So this just extends jQuery so I can just call into that. I can do it getting all the vars. I can get a specific var by name, or I can get a decoded var, which is often what we need. It's like a HTTP, what is it called? An HTML encode, right, of the actual value on the query string. Then down here, I've got my namespace again, and inside of my namespace, I've got an SP class, which has an add status and a load scripts method. And then down at the very bottom, I've got an error class that has a show exception with a public representation of show exception. Is that feeling comfortable to read? You guys like that? Yeah. I like it a lot. It's so much better than the JavaScript I used to write. It's like, wow, this is readable. So I've got show exception. If I just jump back over to where I was, I have to make sure that my page, though, my JSON page, includes this utility reference. Right? If I include the utility reference, it has to be before my reference to the actual code where it's being used. Okay, so I know it feels maybe I'm teaching you some rudimentary JavaScript things, but they're important if you're going to do JSON right. If you don't do these things, you're going to be like just struggling against it, fighting it constantly. So I want JavaScript to be my favorite language, and it's getting there, right? It's getting there. All right, so I have this other way of calling it using this utility script. I'm going to go ahead and hit F5 on there and see how that goes. I remember why I did this now. So this is the, what did I forget to do? Well, it's going to look like everything went just fine, right? It's going to go out to Office 365 and show me my name again. However, I did two things that I didn't intend to do. Number one is go to Office 365 in order to display this content. It says better JavaScript instead of JSON, right? The second thing I failed to do is to change the page. right? So as you're walking through this model, if you want to come back and look at this later, write these 5 things down. Look at default first, then look at better JavaScript, then look at JSOM, then look at JSOM underscore XSS for cross-site scripting, because I got to do some extra work to this in order to make it go. And then finally look at JSOM underscore leaders. So I want to get something out of that other website other than just a title. And it'll show you how to do a camel query and some other sort of client object model stuff. All right, so far so good, right? We've got this idea that we can do better JavaScript and that we can call into the JavaScript object model from a utility class if we need to. Now what we're going to do is we're going to introduce the idea that I don't just want to get the current user's title, I want to get the current host web's title. It's a simple step up from the current user to the current host web, but the actual code to implement that is sizably different. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and add those 2 additional resources back in here. Add a page called, actually I'm going to add it since it's in the reverse order, the JSOM underscore XSS. Another nice thing about having these in separate files like this is you can do a diff. And you can see, well, what changed from this one to that one. So you can progress along with me here. So I'm going to go to the JSOM XSS, and I added it to the wrong place again. And I'm going to go ahead and add the page this time to the pages folder. And this one contains the actual meat. This is our big transition here, pages and JSOM XSS. Let me go ahead and do 2 things. I'm going to change the app manifest to point to that new page. And I'm going to change the actual property of my project to be that Evo site that I was using at the beginning. It is nice that we can do Office 365, right, and test a developer site there, but I find it still faster, especially on an airplane, right, for me to be doing it this way. If you've tried to connect to one of those airplane Wi-Fi things, they're a joke. You'll literally just spend one whole trip pushing F5 once to get your stuff to round trip and everything. So they do have Wi-Fi in planes, but unless you're on a flight across the actual ocean, you're probably not going to get a lot of work done. evo.spdevs.net, that's my site. And so I'm going to run it once so you can actually see what comes back. It should say, hello, and then the name of my host web. Now that's up in the auto-generated Chrome. And I'm not talking about Chrome for this particular talk, right? But when you're in a self-hosted app, you have to manage the Chrome yourself, right? So there's some additional work you have to do once you get there. You'll see when I jump over to self-hosted that it's going to be like, it's just a blank white page. And Microsoft, of course, currently presents that as an opportunity for you to write whatever user interface you'd like. I'm not kidding. When I first started doing this, I was like, wow, we finally have a list creator, right? We can create a list definition and a list instance and everything right there in the tooling. And it's not doing it, is it? Initializing. Come on. Aww. Well, let's just see what's going on. So I'm going to go ahead and get out of there because it's supposed to say the same name as it says up here, on-premise dev site, but it doesn't say that right now. So let's go take a look and see if maybe I can see what changed. If I go into my page first, remember it whites out when I go here for some reason. I'm putting the jQuery CDN in there, I've got the utility reference in there, and I've got a reference to an underlying JS file called jsom_xss.js, all running in some other folder. Now, the fact that it's running in some other folder is actually a little bit important. You see this underscore references.js? If you want to have Intellisense from your classes defined in other files within that same folder, you need to put a // comment at the top of the underscore references.js. So in order for me to actually get Intellisense, I have to come add something here. And they automatically know to pick that up in Visual Studio. So check this out. If I go to my XSS here, and I try to type something from MindSharp error in my document ready. So MindSharp, come on, Intellisense should be popping up here. No error, just demo, right? My only class available here is MindSharp.demo. So how do I get MindSharp.error to show up in there? Well, I have to refer to my utility class from the references folder. So I'm simply going to say whack, 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 reference, and I should be getting Intellisense here too. equals the actual utility class. And that's it. That's all I have to do. Self-closing tag. I'll go ahead and come back over to my other environment. Let's see, Control-Tab, and try to type that again. Am I in the same place? I'm not. Let's go to the JSOM XSS. And I'm going to go ahead and type minesharp dot, and now I should have error, right? So isn't that slick? So don't miss the ///, right? That's an important piece. By the way, if you're doing actually JSOM, if you're doing a lot of it, Intellisense is crucial. That said, it's going to feed you lies. You'll type dot and it'll be like, oh, I can get to that variable. That's great. But you really can't. So just take it with a grain of salt. At least you can see I can get to some pretty nice stuff, right? It does know about things that are possible here, like show exception. So the Intellisense is better than we've ever had, but it's still got a little ways to go, in my opinion. All right, so what is this one going to do? Well, we've defined our namespace here, right? We've actually got on our document ready that we're going to call into our class and load our scripts. Ooh, load scripts, that's new, right? And then I'm going to go ahead and call into my demo get host web title. Well, Todd, I don't understand this syntax. I'm just passing the name of the class I want it to call, right? Or the name of the method I want it to call when that method that I'm calling is done. That's all I'm doing here is I'm passing. It's almost like a delegate, right? I'm using JavaScript in a very modern way by passing classes around or passing anonymous methods around is really what I'm talking here, right? So I'm passing a method name that I'm going to execute when I'm done. So I'm going to go take a look at load scripts. If I come down here to the bottom and I take a look at what I got here, load scripts is going to call the local private, the private function called load scripts. Load scripts private function is going to take the next script and it's going to use it to call into when this get script is done. What's get script? Hey, this is really cool. In order for us to do this request executor, we actually have to load up 3 different JavaScript files from SharePoint. Those JavaScript files are on the host web, not on the app web. So I could do a direct hard-coded reference to them. Don't do that. That's really bad because it's only going to run in one place where you installed the app, right? Number 2, I could go get a copy of them and bring them into my project and deploy them until SharePoint does an update and then my stuff's out of sync with their stuff. So that's probably not the best reference. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, we can figure out who the host web is. If we can figure that out, right, then we can call get script and dynamically load from the _layouts15 folder the runtime, then the SP, then request executor directly from the place where I actually want to go run that script. So I'm going to use the host web's reference to go get those 3 files and dynamically load them into this page's memory. That's slick. Right? It's using the same basic concept though, right? It's saying get script is going to take a script and once that's loaded, on success it's going to call this function, right? Which does a get script and on success it's going to call this function, which on success is going to call next script. Hey, that's pretty slick, right? What's next script? Well, up here next script was what I passed in. That's minesharp.demo.get host web title. So I come back down to my public infrastructure and I go get web title calls into, this private member, how come I can't say it? Method. So I go look at execute cross-domain request. Remember, we're going to cross-domain. So I'm going to execute the cross-domain request by creating, hey, look at that. Isn't that the code we saw on the slide? Right? I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to grab the app web. Wait a second. When did we load all of that? Where did that all come from? Don't forget, we're kind of in a class, right? A static class. So up here, when I established the module level private variables, I said go get the URL off of the app, out of the query string for the app web. Go get the host web URL. So grab those 2 directly out of the query string as I'm coming initially having my app launched, right? This is my start page, so I'm going to get that information directly from the standard tokens that are passed in. If you don't know what the standard tokens are, let me just quickly show you. In the app manifest, it basically says that I have standard tokens. And I'm going to show you at the very tippy end of this, right, how we can actually supplement those tokens with our own, right? So we can have more query string variables than just those. All right, I'm going to go back to where I was. So these are module level variables that have default values, and I'm taking advantage of that later, right? So I'm just establishing these. The reason these other 3 are up here as module level variables is because I want to use them across functions. right? It's just the same stuff you already understand about how managed code works, right? So if I come back down here to my load scripts, it's going to fire off next script. Next script is going to be this get host web title, which executes cross-domain request, which is going to go create a factory, an iframe, right? Pass it into the execute factory, which gives me a context. And then from the context, I'm going to grab the host web context to get my app site context. Sorry, my app context site. My app context site can yield the actual host web. Now I have an instance of my host web. What do I have to do? Make it a value object so that I can do stuff with it, right? So I load it. And then I call execute query async. What does that do? It says, go up to the server, do all that stuff I just told you to do, and send me back a host web, an actual real live client-side host web. Now I'm going to have a host web on my box. If I succeed, I'm going to call on success. Otherwise, I'm going to call this show exception, which is going to actually write out a status bar thing saying, hey, something went wrong. Yeah? So then I come back up here a little ways. I see on success. I'm just going to write out the current host web's title. Very slick. And it does. It works really neat. I'm not sure why it failed because it all looks like it went like it should. Let me try to run it one more time. Any questions about that? Just fire out a question if you missed something there. That's sort of the baseline of how we're going to do stuff. Go ahead, Wes.
Just an additional thing on the tokens. I found while developing an app for Office hosted on SharePoint within a SharePoint hosted app.
Yes.
It never gets past those tokens.
App for Office doesn't get past the same tokens that the SharePoint context does. Yeah. So don't develop any apps for Office, right? They're useless. I don't know why it says initializing. Something's not firing right. I'm not going to go research it right now. I'll take a look at that before I actually put the code up into this link so you can have working code. It was working until I came down here, so I'm not sure what's different, but all right. Now, there's one last thing. So what's the likelihood that what you're going to want is to get the host web's title? Well, that's nice. And actually, when you're in Chrome control, that's something that you might want to do, right? If you're in a provider or auto-hosted app, you might want to go and find the host web's title so you can present it up in the Chrome control. The reason is because if you don't, then you can't go into a marketplace, right? You have to have the host web's title in order to populate that. So you're going to have to do this code that I just showed you. However, I'm going to go get some data. I'm going to actually go query the data. What language do we have to query SharePoint from? JSOM. It's 4 letters long, starts with a C. Camel. The collaborative application markup language is required. So we're going to have to understand how to do a little bit of camel. Don't you wish they had like link to JavaScript for camel or something? Like, that would be really nice. Let me go ahead and add one last page into this context. So I'm going to right click on pages and add an existing item. The existing item is my page this time. How about that? It's going to be called JSON Leaders. Right, I'm going to go ahead and add that page, and then I'm going to add the corresponding JavaScript. Oh, I should mention this. Could you put the JavaScript directly in the page? Yes. Yes, you could. You could embed it directly in the page. Should you put the JavaScript directly in the page? Probably not. Not the best approach. You were just building a web form application here. Since I mentioned that, is it okay for us to go ahead and build an MVC? Absolutely. Right? So all you got to do is delete off the actual, sorry, this is SharePoint hosted app. Never mind, scratch that. We're actually in SharePoint. It's not an MVC. Right? When we do the next project, I can talk about that. All right, so let's just take a look. I'm going to change the app manifest to use our new page, the leaders page. And this is my last JSOM example. I'm going to open up the JSOM leaders page and wait for Visual Studio to time out. It's basically got that same parallel that we just talked about, right? The idea that I'm using the CDN, I'm referring to the utilities before I'm calling into my JSON leaders JavaScript file, and I've got a change to the header, right? That's all that's happening in here. I can't move on though. In the JSON leaders JavaScript, which, did I not get it? What, you're serious? I thought I added that already. All right, I'm gonna try it one more time. So I'm going to go back to my scripts. Scripts. There it is. And find JSON leaders. All right, so that's the thing we really want to understand is what's going on here, right? Use strict at the top, got my namespace, got my document load. You already understand this construct, right? The way we're actually loading calling the first method and then having it call into the next method. The big difference here is that load scripts, that public interface down at the bottom down here, load scripts is going to call load scripts which actually just calls into my SP class and does the common load scripts. We do that a lot. So why write that whole long thing in every single block of JavaScript that you're going to do, right? Anything you do over and over again, put it into your utility class. You're going to feel a lot better about your code. You're going to so much more readable. Refactored, just like you would if you were working with classes, right? And it's a huge boon to the people who are trying to understand what you wrote, right? The more it looks like this. All right, so I'm going to call load scripts. It's just going to call into the utility class with the host web URL. Again, I can't emphasize enough. If you're on a postback, right, or you're in some other page, you're going to have that host URL somewhere because it's only given to you once. And then Wes says if you're in apps for Office, it's not even that many times, right? So it's important that if you're in an app for SharePoint, the first time your page is loaded, you go save that stuff aside somewhere, right? That's not in this code, but you need to be able to do that. All right, so then after load scripts, it goes to next script. Next script is called, what is it, get leaders, I think. Get leaders, right? They're at the very bottom. Get leaders translates to the execute cross-domain request. If I go up a little ways, I'll see execute cross-domain request gets the app web locally here. This is a localized variable. So I don't have to only have module level variables. I can have method level variables as well, right? Notice the one var, that's a stylistic thing that if you use Jslint, they're going to start forcing you into, right? But it actually makes it quite pretty. And then I've got my factory, my context is set, and I end up with my app context site where I get my host web. I pass my host web into the load so that I get an actual value object out of it. Call asynchronous query, right? Which loads up the on get host web success, which if I go up, here's the meat of it, right? On get host web success is a local function or a method, right? That's got a couple of local variables here. It uses the get URL var from the utilities from the $Jquery extension. So if you want to make it easy to read in your utility, extend Jquery itself. And you've got an example in there that shows you how to do that. I'm going to just go extract out of the URL the country that we're currently passing it. So in the app manifest, I can go ahead and I can add a country into this query string that I've got. If I just say ampersand country, since I'm currently in the UK, I'm going to pass it UK. And now I've got a new variable that is available to me to pick off of this on the first page that gets called into. Right? If I want to retain that for subsequent pages, again, you have to do your own state management. All right, so I'm going to pass in the UK. If I come back over here, it says if it's the UK, then call the list name whatever this enumeration is. So I've given you an example of an enumeration. If I scroll up here a little ways, at the very top, so here's my class. I went ahead and defined an enumeration. Now you can actually give an enumeration in JavaScript any number of values. So I could say I have a code equal to, code colon 1. So my code for the UK list could be 1, and my code for the US list could be 2. I'm not using those variables, but I could. Now the reason I point this enumeration out is because if you decide to go get my lists and you don't decide to name them with the same names I've chosen here, all you have to do is modify this enumeration, right? And it'll call into the right place. In fact, what could I do? I could go to the host web and I could enumerate all of the lists that are there and let the person choose which list that they would like to see all the titles for. Right? I don't even have to go with a hard-coded value here. It was just easier for me to, let me say it differently. It wasn't that it was easier for me, but the code would have become quite convoluted, right, for me to teach from if I went off and started doing lots of calls back and stuff like that. So I just kept it simple here. I hard-coded it. Right? But you could go get these values directly off of the host web to find out which lists we could enumerate. Find out if the list that you think is there is actually there, right, using the client-side object model. All right, so I'm grabbing a couple of module-level variables here. Some are pre-populated, some are not. I've got a couple of methods. Oh, let me show you this one thing, Control-M, Control-O. That stands for method outline. And in our C# context, in our managed code context, I rely on it heavily. Control-M, Control-O. Control-M, Control-L is for all, I guess. I don't know what it stands for, but it means expand them all, right? And O means outline. But it all collapsed up into my class here. If I expand that, look at this. I can actually see each method. Private method, private method, private method, private method, and then my two public exposing those methods out. That's pretty slick, isn't it? All right, so what does this do? From load scripts, of course, it does the normal load scripting thing that I talked about, right? Then it calls into the execute cross-domain request. So in execute cross-domain request, we actually pick up our app web URL, et cetera, generate our host web. From our host web, right, if we successfully get the host web, if we don't, we're going to get an exception, right? So we have exception handling here, which is pretty slick. I'm going to go ahead and expand out my on host web success, where I'm going to actually check to see if I've got the country, and if I do, then I'm going to pick up which one I want. If I don't, then I'm just going to use a US list, because we all know that US presidents, oh, wait a minute, England's been around longer. Should probably. Oh, well, I exposed my loyalties there. Here's my camel query. That's pretty slick, right? I'm just going to establish a view that has the fields, the where clause, the order by, and a row limit if I want. All of those are not required, but it's just standard camel. So if you already know how to do camel, boom, there it is right here in JavaScript. Yeah, it's pretty nasty looking, isn't it? But that's what it looks like. If you've got ideas about stylistically making that cooler, I'm interested in hearing those. So then all I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and get all the items from my localized list here. Notice I haven't gone back to the server yet. I'm just piling up lots of requests for it, right? I load those leaders so that I'm going to have a value object when I'm done, and I call execute query async. That's going to get the items successfully and run that final method up here, which basically says, iterate through. Here's an example of iteration of a client-side JavaScript list that came back from the server, right? It's a very nice while loop that iterates through each move next to grab off the current record and then do something with it. Whatever I want to do, I'm going to grab the title off of this one. When I get the title, I'm just jamming it onto a string over and over again. Yes, you could do other cool stuff with list items, et cetera, right? I just wanted to keep it super simple, right? So I just put a string with a BR behind it, which gives us all of the titles that meet this query. Note that the title column begins with A. So these are all my A-listers for my prime ministers, right? So if I hit F5, it should go ahead and generate this and take us out to where those lists are. Query up to the host web. The host web will give me back the right context that I can then query the lists. And, what's going on? Actually, is it the jQuery reference? It could very well be. Although you would think I would get an actual exception on that. Let me just check. I did do an update to Visual Studio, so it is possible, because it went from 1.7 to 1.8. It is possible that it's that. It's also possible, I've noticed with update 2, that if you deploy and then go look at your results, it works. But if you hit F5, it doesn't. It's something about how they're actually grabbing onto stuff isn't quite working properly. So let me just check real quick. If I change my JSOM leaders, I'm going to see that I'm using a reference here to 1.7. Let me just change that to 1.8.2 in both places. Although I shouldn't have to have a jQuery thingy going on here. Oh, come on, Visual Studio. I realize that I'm just a few minutes over, but let me just go a little bit further because I want to show you one more thing. If you go into the CSOM side of the world, right, we just explored JSOM pretty thoroughly. But the CSOM side of the world is a radically different perspective, right? If I'm actually trying to do all of this in a CSOM perspective, and actually, I'm going to go ahead and try that idea of a deploy and then see if I can just run it instead of F5, because I think it might be the F5 that's causing it. So if I just do a deploy instead, it should go through the same process, but it'll pop up and it'll run the code instead of trying to establish the context. So let's see if it does it. It just says deploy succeeded. Go back over here to my, it's actually my Evo site just locally on my box here, and try to run my Evo SharePoint hosted. Still not working. Okay, well, I'll make sure that that does translate. I could go into the debugger, of course, right? I could actually hit each step by just hitting an F9 and then pushing F5 and making it run. The last thing I want to show you, though, is I'm just going to open up. No, I'm going to go to the slides. That'll be the fastest way to do this. This is only 2 ways to get context. There's actually a couple of other ways to get context. If you're in ACS, right, then you're going to be in a C# context because you can't do JSOM from ACS. You have to do, that's not 100% true. If you're going to do JSOM from ACS, you actually have to give it the token, right? Or use the get script to go to the host web, pull in all the scripts, and then call the same way we did with the SharePoint hosted app. But if you're in a context where you've got managed code, this is what will be in your body page on load, on your page on load. If you're in an S2S context, it will be a slightly different presentation. The difference is that one uses a token and the other uses the identity of the user to pass up. Okay, and so we have to merge those two together if you might be in either one. And then I went through my demos. I got through just the first set of demos. The other demos I'll include, so you'll have the actual code so you can walk through. It's the same basic process, except for the auto-hosted demo is only 2 pages, right? Default, and then the second page, which is the managed code. And then the provider-hosted one is the same. Note, if you decide to go provider-hosted, you're going to have to create an S2S environment, which means, in brief, you have to create a certificate with a PFX file. And then you have to register that certificate with your provider-hosted app and tell SharePoint that you did that for each site collection where you want to use it. That way SharePoint can trust, it's called a high trust context, SharePoint can trust that app to pass in the identity that we want to use in that context. That's all that's going on there, right? So that has to be done before you can actually do the provider-hosted one, unless you're going to deploy to Office 365. Then you can use the ACS, and it'll just work just fine. All right? I hope you enjoyed this. Again, I'll put the code up. I'll just give you the URL one more time so that you can go back and take a look and really dig in and understand it, right? It's going to be under tinyurl.com/evo dev210. All right, have a good day.